Have you ever felt that by moving closer to your children in your old age, the love you sought has turned into an invisible burden? In this video, we're going to explore an uncomfortable yet revealing truth. What if living near your children in old age isn't bringing the peace you expected, but rather the opposite? Through Buddhist wisdom, we'll understand why true happiness isn't always found in the external, but in cultivating our own inner space. Stay until the end, because what you'll discover may change your life. Attachment is a recurring theme in Buddhist teachings. The Buddha teaches us that all attachment leads to suffering because we cling to what is impermanent. Everything changes: circumstances, people, and even ourselves. Living without understanding this truth can lead us to believe that certain bonds or situations will bring us lasting peace and happiness. This is the trap of attachment. Rosa, when she moved closer to her daughter, was seeking something beyond mere cohabitation. Deep down, she wanted to maintain control over a life that felt like it was slipping out of her hands. Old age, like many other stages of life, is filled with uncertainty. After losing her husband, Rosa not only lost her life partner, but also her sense of security. At that moment, she decided that being close to her children would protect her from loneliness, from the existential void she had begun to feel. However, Buddhism reminds us that people, no matter how much we love them, are not permanent. We cannot rely on them to fill our emotional voids. By doing so, we create expectations, and when those expectations aren't met or change, suffering arises. Rosa, when she moved in with Lucia, believed that physical closeness would bring emotional closeness, and at first it did. But soon, she began to realize that this closeness came with unspoken responsibilities, with expectations that weighed on her like an invisible burden. This is where Buddhism calls us to reflect. If everything in life is impermanent, why do we cling to external things to find peace? True peace, according to the Buddha's teachings, is not found in what surrounds us, but in how we relate to what surrounds us. If Rosa had understood from the beginning that her happiness didn't depend on being close to her children, perhaps she would have sought the emotional independence she needed instead of relying on her family for comfort. A fundamental aspect of attachment is that it makes us believe we need to control situations to be okay. Rosa, by moving in with her daughter, was trying to control her future, ensuring that she would never be alone. But the reality is that control is an illusion. We cannot control external circumstances. We can only control how we respond to them. Instead of seeking control over her life through proximity to her family, Rosa could have sought acceptance of her situation, understanding that solitude is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Attachment, when viewed through the lens of Buddhism, becomes a source of learning. It shows us our insecurities, our doubts, our anxieties. Rosa, upon realizing that her situation with her daughter was leading her to frustration and exhaustion, began to understand that her attachment to the idea that being useful and being close would make her happy was what was actually making her suffer. This is a fundamental step on the Buddhist path, recognizing attachment, seeing it as the root of suffering, and beginning the process of letting go. In Buddhist practice, letting go doesn't mean stopping loving or caring for others. It doesn't mean distancing ourselves from loved ones or living an isolated life. It means understanding that our happiness doesn't depend on them. It means we can love without expecting anything in return, without clinging to people or circumstances to find a sense of security. It is an act of deep love, both for ourselves and for others, because it frees us from expectations and allows us to be more authentic in our relationships. When we talk about balance in Buddhism, we talk about finding the middle way between extremes. Buddha's middle way refers to avoiding both excessive indulgence and deprivation. It's a principle we can apply to all aspects of our lives, and one that Rosa, in her journey, also needed to discover. Rosa, by moving in with her daughter, had fallen into the extreme of sacrifice. Her entire life revolved around the needs of others. While the desire to be useful and to care for loved ones is natural and beautiful, when it's not balanced with self-care, it becomes a source of exhaustion. This is where one of the most important teachings of Buddhism comes into play. We must find balance between giving and receiving, between caring for others and caring for ourselves. When Rosa realized she was neglecting her own needs, she began to feel a sense of emptiness. Buddhism teaches us that if we don't cultivate balance in our lives, we lose our center, disconnect from our essence, and begin to feel lost. Rosa had reached a point where she no longer recognized herself. She no longer had time for her hobbies, for reflection, or for caring for her own well-being. Her life had been consumed by family responsibilities. Balance is essential, not only for our physical well-being, but also for our emotional and spiritual health. In Buddhist teachings, we are encouraged to practice mindfulness to observe our lives and realize when we are falling into one extreme or another. For Rosa, mindfulness was the tool that helped her recognize that her life was unbalanced, that she was giving too much without allowing herself to receive. Balance also involves setting boundaries. Often, we believe we must always be available to others, that saying no is an act of selfishness. But Buddhism teaches us that we cannot help others if we don't first help ourselves. We cannot care for others if we are not balanced and at peace. Rosa needed to learn to say no when necessary, to reserve time for herself without feeling guilty or remorseful. This process of finding balance is not easy. It requires courage and discipline. It requires us to face our deepest beliefs about duty and sacrifice, and to learn to see self-care as an act of love, not an act of selfishness. In Buddhism, self-care is seen as an integral part of spiritual well-being. It's not about indulgence, but about keeping our body and mind in harmony so we can serve others in a fuller and more genuine way. One of the most profound principles of Buddhism is that true inner peace does not depend on external circumstances. We live in a world where we often seek happiness in what is outside of us, in our relationships, in our possessions, in our experiences. However, Buddha taught us that the source of true peace is within us, in our ability to find calm and balance in the midst of chaos. In Rosa's story, we see how her dependence on her family to find meaning and purpose in her life led her to lose her inner peace. She had convinced herself that being close to her daughter and grandchildren would make her happy, but in reality, that closeness had disconnected her from her true self. Buddhism teaches us that if we don't cultivate our spiritual autonomy, we will always depend on others to find satisfaction, and that dependence will inevitably lead to suffering. Spiritual autonomy is the ability to find peace and satisfaction within ourselves, regardless of external circumstances. It doesn't mean we don't love or care for others, but that our happiness doesn't depend on them. For Rosa, this was a process of awakening. Upon realizing that her current situation wasn't bringing her the peace she sought, she began to explore the idea of reconnecting with her inner self. Meditation, a central practice in Buddhism, is a powerful tool for cultivating this spiritual autonomy. Through meditation, we can observe our thoughts and emotions without clinging to them, without allowing them to dominate us. For Rosa, meditation was a way to reconnect with the part of herself she had forgotten. By sitting in silence and simply observing her thoughts, she could see how much she had been seeking happiness in the external, and how much she had neglected her own inner well-being. Inner peace is not something that can be found outside of us. It is not found in the company of others, in material possessions, or in external circumstances. It is found in our ability to accept life as it is, without clinging to what we wish it were. Rosa, by beginning to practice meditation and inner reflection, began to understand that her peace didn't depend on being close to her family, but on her ability to be at peace with herself, regardless of where she lived or who she was with. Buddhism teaches us that detachment doesn't mean renouncing our relationships or our responsibilities, but learning to relate to them in a more balanced and healthy way. Rosa, by cultivating her spiritual autonomy, was able to see that her love for her family didn't have to be based on physical proximity, but on the quality of her interactions. By letting go of the idea that she needed to be close to her family to be happy, she was able to find a more authentic way of loving and being loved. Rosa's transformation was a process of rebirth. Like many older people, she had believed that her life was coming to an end, that she no longer had much to offer or experience. But Buddhism teaches us that every stage of life is an opportunity for growth and evolution. No matter how old we are, we can always keep learning, always keep growing. For Rosa, this rebirth began with small steps. At first, it was simply setting aside time for herself, for things she enjoyed and that brought her joy. It may seem trivial, but in reality, it was a profound act of self-care and self-love. Buddhism teaches us that the path to enlightenment begins with cultivating inner peace. And for Rosa, this cultivation began when she decided that she deserved to have time for herself. By reconnecting with her passions, such as painting, Rosa began to rediscover who she was beyond her role as a mother and grandmother. She began to remember that she was a person with interests, dreams, and desires. This is a fundamental aspect of spiritual rebirth in Buddhism, remembering our true nature, beyond the roles and labels that society imposes on us. Rosa was no longer defined only as a mother or grandmother, but as a woman with her own life, with a path that still had much to offer. In Buddhism, we are taught that change is a constant. Life is in a state of perpetual flow, and we must learn to flow with it. Rosa, by accepting that her life was changing, by letting go of attachment to her past identity, was able to open herself to new experiences and opportunities. This process of transformation is an essential part of the Buddhist path. No matter our age, we can always transform, we can always be reborn. In Rosa's story, a fundamental aspect is how her relationship with her family changes as she herself changes. One of the pillars of Buddhist teachings is the practice of detachment, which invites us to love without expectations or dependencies. In Rosa's case, her relationship with her daughter Lucia and her grandchildren was initially based on emotional dependency and a strong expectation that her physical presence would generate well-being and satisfaction for both herself and her family. At first, everything seemed to work perfectly. Rosa felt useful, she was busy with household chores, and she spent time with her grandchildren. However, as mentioned earlier, this lifestyle began to weigh on her, as Rosa felt her life had been reduced solely to being the caregiver of her grandchildren. Her personal identity was dissolving into the needs of others, and little by little, this dependency began to generate frustration. Buddhism teaches that true love must be unconditional and free from attachments. In the context of family relationships, this means that we can love our children, grandchildren, and loved ones without the need to control them or depend on them emotionally. For Rosa, the process of transformation began when she realized that she could love her family in a healthier and more balanced way, without sacrificing her own well-being. Rosa began to understand that authentic love doesn't depend on always being physically present or on fulfilling everyone's expectations. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that true love allows each individual to be who they are, without imposing expectations or depending on their behavior to find our own happiness. This is what the Buddhist philosopher Thich Nhat Hanh calls compassionate love, love that arises from understanding and freedom, not from need. By deciding to seek her own space, Rosa was not only regaining her independence but also transforming her relationship with her family. She no longer felt obligated to be constantly available, which allowed her to approach her family from a place of freedom, not sacrifice. Buddhism teaches that when we free people from our expectations, we allow relationships to flourish in a more genuine and profound way. Rosa discovered that by having her own space and time for herself, her visits with her daughter and grandchildren became more enjoyable and meaningful. There was room for sincere connection, and her presence was no longer associated with obligation. This change not only benefited Rosa, but also her daughter Lucia and her grandchildren. In many families, parents or grandparents who continuously sacrifice themselves can create unwanted tensions. The lack of clear boundaries can lead to resentment, even when love is deep. In Rosa's case, by establishing a balance between her independence and her family responsibilities, everyone in the family benefited from a healthier and more genuine relationship. Lucia could see her mother as a complete person, not just as a grandmother who was there to care for the children, and the grandchildren began to enjoy the company of a grandmother who was more present and emotionally balanced. The Buddhist concept of love without attachment also implies that each person has their own path to walk. Children grow up, form their own families, and in many cases, follow paths different from those of their parents. Rosa understood that her role as a mother and grandmother was important, but it wasn't the only role she had in life. By regaining her autonomy, Rosa showed her daughter that the process of aging doesn't have to mean a loss of identity or independence. Instead of becoming a burden to her family, Rosa became an example of strength and wisdom. The physical distance Rosa established from her family didn't weaken their bonds, but strengthened them. In Buddhism, we are taught that detachment doesn't mean emotional disconnection, but a healthier and more balanced relationship with others. By setting boundaries and prioritizing her well-being, Rosa not only regained her independence, but also revitalized her relationship with her family. The visits were no longer a daily obligation, but special moments that everyone looked forward to. This brings us to one of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism: interdependence. Although detachment is important, Buddhism also recognizes that we are all interconnected. We are not separate islands, but rather our actions, thoughts, and emotions influence others. By seeking her own inner peace, Rosa was positively impacting her family. She was showing them that love and respect go hand in hand with autonomy, and that by taking care of herself, she was also taking care of them. In the Buddhist tradition, old age is not seen as a stage of decline, but as an opportunity for contemplation, detachment, and spiritual growth. Often, modern society tends to view old age as a time of loss of physical abilities, independence, or relevance. However, Buddhism teaches us that old age is a precious time to deepen our spiritual practice, to reflect on impermanence, and to cultivate wisdom. Rosa's story is a clear example of how we can transform our old age into a time of renewal and discovery. At first, Rosa, like many older people, believed that her role in life was limited to caring for her family. She felt that by being close to her children and grandchildren, she was fulfilling her duty. But what Rosa didn't understand at the time was that old age is also an opportunity to cultivate her own inner being. Buddhism teaches us that life is full of cycles of change, and old age is one of those cycles. Instead of resisting the changes that aging brings, Buddhism invites us to embrace them with compassion and wisdom. Rosa, by learning to detach from her exclusive role as a mother and grandmother, was able to see that her life still had much to offer her. By enrolling in a painting workshop and rediscovering her passion for art, Rosa began to live her old age from a place of expansion rather than contraction. This is a powerful message for all older people. Old age doesn't have to be a time of resignation or loss. On the contrary, it can be a time of deep spiritual growth. By practicing mindfulness and meditation, we can learn to be present in each moment, to accept our situation as it is, and to find peace in the here and now. Buddhism also teaches us that old age is an ideal time to practice detachment. As we age, we begin to see more clearly the impermanent nature of life. The people around us change, our bodies change, and our circumstances change as well. This impermanence can be a source of suffering if we cling to what was, or it can be a source of liberation if we learn to accept it with equanimity. Rosa, by practicing detachment, not only freed herself from the expectations of her family, but also from her own. She let go of the idea that she had to always be the perfect grandmother, always available for others, and began to understand that her worth didn't depend on what she did for others, but on who she was in her essence. This is one of the most profound principles of Buddhism. Our true value doesn't come from what we do or how others see us, but from our ability to be at peace with ourselves. By accepting her old age as a stage of growth and transformation, Rosa was able to experience a spiritual rebirth. Her relationship with her family improved, but more importantly, her relationship with herself transformed. Buddhism teaches us that the path to enlightenment begins with deep self-knowledge, and Rosa, through the practice of detachment and meditation, began to know herself on a deeper level. The process of transformation for Rosa didn't just involve an external change, such as moving and setting clearer boundaries with her family, but it was also an internal spiritual rebirth. As Rosa learned to detach from the expectations she had about her role in the family, she also discovered a new way of relating to life itself. Buddhism teaches us that life is in constant change, and this change is something we must accept with grace. Throughout her life, Rosa had gone through many stages: youth, motherhood, widowhood, and now old age. Each of these stages had something to teach her, but in old age, Rosa discovered something that many people fail to see, that she still had the power to change, grow, and evolve. The spiritual rebirth she experienced was a clear example of how detachment and meditation can open new doors in a person's life, no matter their age. One of the fundamental concepts of Buddhism is impermanence, known as anicca in Pali. Everything changes, nothing remains the same, and this is the true nature of existence. When Rosa accepted this truth, she began to see her life from a new perspective. Before, her attachment to the idea of being the perfect caregiver had kept her in an emotional prison. But once she understood that change is inevitable and necessary, she began to see life with a new sense of freedom. Through her spiritual practice, Rosa also learned to cultivate what in Buddhism is called upekkha, or equanimity. Equanimity is the ability to maintain a calm and balanced mind without being carried away by extreme emotions, whether happiness or suffering. In the past, Rosa had been carried away by the suffering she felt from not being able to meet all the expectations of her family and herself. But through the practice of equanimity, she learned to see situations more clearly, without being swept away by the impulse to please others at the expense of her own well-being. This spiritual rebirth of Rosa also allowed her to rediscover aspects of herself that she had forgotten. Through meditation and the time she dedicated to her personal growth, she began to remember the things that truly made her happy. She rediscovered her passion for painting, an art she had set aside for many years while raising her family. For many people, retirement and old age are often seen as a time of decline, but for Rosa, it was a time of creative rebirth. Buddhism teaches us that creativity has no age and that we can always find new ways to express ourselves, regardless of our stage in life. Rosa's rebirth also brought her a greater connection with nature. Often, in modern life, we disconnect from the natural world, caught up in our daily responsibilities and the rush of life. However, in Buddhist teachings, nature plays a fundamental role as a mirror of our own impermanence and connection with the whole. Rosa began to spend more time outdoors, enjoying peaceful walks in the park and observing the beauty of life's cycles in the plants, trees, and changing sky. This connection with nature not only brought her peace, but also reminded her of the importance of living in the present and appreciating the beauty that exists in every moment. Another of the fundamental pillars of Buddhism that Rosa began to practice was gratitude. In the Buddhist tradition, gratitude is a form of meditation in itself. When we focus on the things we are grateful for, we begin to see life from a more positive perspective, and our mind fills with peace. For Rosa, practicing gratitude was key to her transformation. Instead of focusing on what she had lost, her youth, constant closeness with her family, she began to appreciate the new opportunities that life offered her. She was grateful for the time she could dedicate to herself, for being healthy enough to continue enjoying her hobbies, and for the visits with her family, which were now more meaningful. Buddhism also teaches us that compassion must extend not only to others but also to ourselves. Often we are very hard on ourselves, and Rosa was no exception. For many years, she had been her own harshest critic, feeling guilty when she couldn't meet the expectations she had imposed on herself. However, by practicing self-compassion, she began to be kinder to herself. She understood that it was okay not to be able to do everything, that she deserved rest, and that caring for her own well-being was as important as caring for others. Self-compassion also allowed her to forgive herself for the decisions she had made in the past, decisions she now saw as mistakes. Sometimes, we tend to carry the weight of our past actions, which prevents us from moving forward. However, Buddhism reminds us that forgiveness, both towards others and towards ourselves, is a liberating act. Rosa learned to forgive herself for having sacrificed so much of herself in the past, and this forgiveness allowed her to move forward with greater lightness and peace. This practice of compassion also transformed the way Rosa viewed her family. Instead of feeling frustrated when things didn't go as she expected, she began to practice compassion towards her daughter and grandchildren, understanding that they too were doing the best they could. This is what Buddhism calls karuna, the compassion that allows us to see the suffering of others and desire to alleviate it without judgment or imposing expectations. One of the most profound aspects of Buddhism is the teaching on impermanence and death. In Western culture, we often avoid talking about death and consider it a taboo subject, something to be feared. However, in Buddhism, death is seen as a natural part of life, something we must contemplate in order to live more fully. By accepting the impermanence of all things, we learn to detach from the fear of death and to appreciate the present moment more. As Rosa aged, she began to reflect on her own mortality, something that had caused her anxiety in the past. However, by studying Buddhist teachings on impermanence, she began to see death in a different way. Death was not something to be feared, but a natural process, a change of form and energy. Instead of worrying about the end of her life, she began to focus on how she wanted to live the years she had left. The Buddhist concept of impermanence applies not only to death, but to all aspects of life. Rosa understood that moments of joy and sadness, relationships with others, and her own physical body were in constant change. This understanding allowed her to stop clinging to expectations of how her old age should be. By accepting the impermanence of everything, Rosa found a new freedom. She stopped resisting change and began to flow with life. Buddhism also teaches us that by contemplating death, we can live more consciously. Rosa, by accepting the inevitability of death, began to value the small moments of her daily life more. Instead of worrying about what she hadn't achieved or what the future might bring, she began to fully enjoy each day. This is the heart of the teaching of mindfulness, being present in each moment without getting caught up in the past or the future. As Rosa progressed on her path of spiritual transformation, she also began to realize that she had much to share with others. In Buddhism, the act of transmitting wisdom and compassion to others is deeply valued, not as an act of superiority, but as an act of generosity. The wisdom Rosa had acquired throughout her life was not only valuable to her, but also to her family and the community around her. Rosa, having gone through a process of detachment and transformation, realized that her experience could be helpful to others who, like her, were struggling with aging and family expectations. She began to share her reflections with her friends, many of whom were also facing the challenges of old age. In Buddhism, the act of sharing knowledge and wisdom is a form of dana, or generosity, and Rosa felt that this was her spiritual legacy. One of the most beautiful aspects of Rosa's spiritual journey was how her family also began to benefit from her transformation. By seeing her live more freely and fully, her daughter Lucia began to question her own beliefs about aging and family. Lucia had grown up thinking she had to take care of her mother at all costs, that physical closeness was synonymous with love. But by seeing her mother flourish in her independence, Lucia began to understand that true love also includes space and freedom. Rosa also began to share with her grandchildren some of the Buddhist teachings she had learned, especially the importance of living in the present and being compassionate towards others. Although the children were still young, Rosa felt she was planting seeds of wisdom in their hearts, seeds that would one day bloom in their own lives. This act of transmitting wisdom is seen in Buddhism as a way of continuing the cycle of life, of passing teachings from generation to generation. Rosa, by sharing what she had learned, was ensuring that her spiritual legacy would live on long after her time on this earth. Her life had not only changed for the better, but she had also inspired those around her to live more consciously and compassionately. One of the greatest challenges we face in life, especially in old age, is dealing with the expectations that society imposes on us. In most cultures, old age is often seen as a stage of retirement, dependence, or even obsolescence. These expectations are powerful and can influence how we see ourselves and the decisions we make. Rosa, like many older people, found herself trapped in these expectations. Society, and even her own family, saw her primarily as a grandmother, a figure who was always expected to be available to care for others. However, Buddhism teaches us to free ourselves from these external expectations. Buddha taught that our lives should not be dictated by what others think of us, but by our own search for truth and inner well-being. Instead of conforming to the roles that society assigns us, we must live according to our own wisdom and understanding. For Rosa, this meant freeing herself from the weight of the expectations of being the perfect grandmother and beginning to live her life from a place of authenticity. This is a process that doesn't happen overnight. Rosa had spent her entire life fulfilling the expectations that others had of her, first as a mother, then as a wife, and finally as a grandmother. She had dedicated much of her time and energy to meeting the needs of others. And now, in her old age, she felt she no longer knew how to live for herself. Letting go of social expectations is one of the most important steps on the spiritual path because it allows us to reconnect with our true nature. Society often tells us that old age is a time of rest, of being cared for by the younger generations, and in many cases, even of invisibility. But Buddhism offers us a completely different perspective. Instead of seeing old age as a stage of decline, it is seen as an opportunity for wisdom and deep reflection. In Buddhist teachings, the elderly are valued for their knowledge and experience, and they are encouraged to share their wisdom with younger generations. However, this doesn't mean that the elderly should sacrifice themselves or fulfill others' expectations. Rosa discovered that she could be a source of wisdom for her family and community without losing her independence or compromising her own well-being. Letting go of social expectations also means freeing ourselves from the fear of being judged. In many cases, the fear of what others think of us can be paralyzing. Rosa at first feared that her family would see her as selfish for wanting to live more independently. She felt that her duty was to always be available for her grandchildren and daughter, and that if she didn't, she would be failing as a mother and grandmother. But through her process of spiritual growth, Rosa realized that living to meet others' expectations was not a path to true peace. Buddhism teaches us that we are all responsible for our own happiness. We cannot rely on others to validate our decisions or give us meaning. When Rosa accepted this truth, she began to feel a new sense of freedom. She no longer needed her family's or society's approval to feel valuable. Her worth came from her own ability to be at peace with herself and live according to her inner truth. Meditation is a central practice in Buddhism, and it was a fundamental tool in Rosa's transformation. Through meditation, we learn to observe our thoughts and emotions without identifying with them. We learn to let emotions come and go without clinging to them or letting them control us. For Rosa, meditation was key in her process of letting go and in her ability to live more fully. At first, Rosa wasn't familiar with meditation. Daily life, with its responsibilities and routine, kept her busy, and she rarely had time to sit in silence and reflect. However, when she began to seek ways to reconnect with herself, she decided to give meditation a try. At first, she found it difficult. Sitting in silence with her thoughts was not something she was used to, and her mind tended to wander. But over time, she began to find peace in the practice. Buddhism teaches us that meditation is a gradual process. It's not about emptying the mind of thoughts, but about learning to observe them without clinging to them. Rosa, through her daily meditation practice, began to notice that many of the emotions that tormented her, guilt, frustration, fear, were not permanent. They were like clouds passing through the sky of her mind, and as she learned to observe them without identifying with them, her suffering began to diminish. Meditation also allowed Rosa to develop greater awareness of herself and her life. Instead of automatically reacting to situations as she used to do, she began to respond more consciously. When she felt overwhelmed by family responsibilities, instead of reacting with frustration or exhaustion, she took a moment to breathe and observe her emotions. This simple act of stopping and breathing allowed her to make more conscious and balanced decisions. Buddhism teaches that the mind is like a garden. If we don't tend to it, weeds will grow, but if we cultivate it with attention and compassion, flowers of peace and wisdom will bloom. Meditation was the way Rosa began to cultivate her mind. Instead of allowing negative emotions to take over, she began to plant seeds of peace, gratitude, and compassion. And over time, these seeds began to bloom in her daily life. In our culture, loneliness is often seen as something negative, something to be avoided. We are taught that being alone is synonymous with being isolated, disconnected, and in many cases, sad. However, in Buddhism, loneliness is seen in a completely different way. Loneliness is not something to be feared, but something that can be deeply enriching. It is a space where we can reconnect with our essence, listen to our inner voice, and find peace. Rosa at first was afraid of being alone. She had spent most of her life surrounded by her family, and the idea of moving to a space where she would spend more time with herself caused her anxiety. However, as she progressed on her spiritual path, she began to see loneliness as an opportunity rather than a burden. By being alone, she had the opportunity to reflect on her life, the decisions she had made, and what she truly wanted for her future. Buddhism teaches us that true loneliness is not about being physically isolated, but about being at peace with ourselves. Rosa learned that she could be alone without feeling lonely. By practicing meditation and mindfulness, she discovered that loneliness was a space for healing and growth. Instead of feeling the weight of loneliness, she began to appreciate it as a time for deep connection with herself. One of the most important aspects of Buddhism is the ability to find joy in the present moment. When we are alone, without the distractions of the outside world, we can connect with the here and now in a deeper way. Rosa, in her time alone, began to practice mindfulness in the small things, in the food she prepared, in the walks she took, in the simple act of breathing. And through this practice, she began to find joy in the simplest moments of life. Loneliness also allowed Rosa to develop greater compassion for others. By having time to reflect on her own emotions and experiences, she was able to see more clearly the struggles and challenges of the people around her. By being at peace with herself, she was also able to be a source of peace for others. This is what Buddhism calls enlightened loneliness, a state in which we are completely at peace with our loneliness. And from that peace, we can offer compassion and love to others without expecting anything in return. In Buddhism, impermanence is one of the central teachings. Everything in life is in constant change: our emotions, our circumstances, our relationships, and ultimately our own physical existence. For Rosa, accepting impermanence was a liberating act. It allowed her to let go of attachment to outcomes, expectations, and worries about the future. Buddhism teaches that by accepting impermanence, we can live more fully in the present moment. Rosa, by embracing this teaching, stopped worrying about what would happen in the future. She no longer clung to the fear of losing her family or becoming irrelevant in their lives. Instead, she began to live each day with gratitude for what she had, without worrying about what she might lose. This acceptance of impermanence also allowed her to approach aging with greater serenity. Instead of seeing her old age as a loss of youth or abilities, she began to see it as a natural stage of life, full of its own opportunities for growth and wisdom. The final letting go that Rosa experienced was letting go of life itself. In Buddhism, we are taught that death is not something to be feared, but a natural change in the cycle of existence. Through her spiritual practice, Rosa came to accept the impermanence of her own life. This didn't mean she stopped valuing her time on earth, but she stopped fearing what would come next. Instead of focusing on death, she chose to focus on how she could live with more compassion, love, and gratitude in the time she had left. Rosa's final detachment also included an acceptance that she couldn't control everything in her life. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from the desire to control and cling to what is impermanent. Rosa, by letting go of the need for control, found a new freedom. She no longer had to worry about what the future would bring because she knew that by accepting change and living in the present, she was at peace with whatever came. Rosa's journey is a reflection of what many people face in old age: the search for balance between family responsibilities and the desire to maintain their independence and emotional well-being. Through Buddhist teachings, Rosa learned valuable lessons that transformed not only her relationship with her family, but also with herself. She learned that true happiness is not found in the external, but in the cultivation of inner peace, the acceptance of impermanence, and the letting go of social and family expectations. Buddhism teaches us that suffering arises from attachment, and that freedom is found when we learn to let go. Rosa experienced this truth in her daily life by letting go of the fear, guilt, and expectations that had weighed her down. Through the practice of meditation, loving kindness, metta, and mindfulness, Rosa discovered that her old age didn't have to be a stage of decline, but a time for spiritual renewal and personal growth. One of the greatest gifts Rosa received through her transformation was the understanding that true love is not possessive or dependent, but flourishes in freedom and mutual respect. By setting healthy boundaries with her family and dedicating time to her own needs, Rosa not only benefited herself, but also inspired her daughter and grandchildren to live in a more balanced way. Rosa's story reminds us that old age is an opportunity to continue learning, growing, and experiencing life with compassion and wisdom. By applying Buddhist teachings in her daily life, Rosa found a new way of living, one that allowed her to be at peace with what is and with what will come. She teaches us that it is never too late to change, to heal, and to live in the present with gratitude and love. If you felt inspired by Rosa's story and the Buddhist teachings we've explored, I invite you to reflect on your own life. Are you clinging to expectations or responsibilities that are preventing you from living fully? Are you dedicating time to take care of yourself, both emotionally and spiritually? Remember that the path to inner peace begins with small steps. Meditation, gratitude, and loving kindness are practices we can all integrate into our daily lives, no matter our age or circumstances. If this video has helped you see things from a different perspective, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may also benefit from these teachings. Together, we can continue learning and growing, walking toward a fuller and more balanced life. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next video.